Hello everyone, this is the channel, History PhD, where we explore fascinating historical mysteries together. Today, I invite you to embark on an extraordinary journey, a story of passion, perseverance, and genius. The story of two bicycle repair brothers who changed the destiny of humankind. On the morning of December 17th, 1903, on the desolate sand dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a miraculous moment occurred. For the first time in history, a man-made machine heavier than air took flight on its own, using the power of its engine. But behind those historic 12 seconds of flight lay more than 4 years of frantic research, thousands of failed experiments, fierce scientific debates, and an engineering secret that even the most brilliant scientists of the time could not decipher. Why did two craftsmen without college degrees manage to outmaneuver top engineers with vast financial resources? Which of their 3 key inventions truly proved their success? And what happened after they proved the dream of flying was no longer impossible? In this 6-part documentary series, we will unravel each piece of this historical puzzle, from a small bicycle repair shop in Dayton, Ohio, to the windswept dunes of Kitty Hawk, from experiments in a makeshift wind tunnel to the global aviation revolution. If you are a history enthusiast, passionate about science, and want to gain a deeper understanding of this extraordinary journey, then subscribe to the History PhD channel. Subscribe today so you don't miss any episodes in this journey of unexpected discovery. Now, let's begin the story with a Christmas gift from 1878. A seemingly simple gift that ignited a revolution. Our story begins in the winter of 1878 in a modest home in Dayton, Ohio. 11-year-old Wilbur Wright and his 7-year-old brother Orville were eagerly awaiting their Christmas present from their father, Milton Wright, a bishop of the Church of the Democratic Brothers. But that year's gift wasn't an ordinary toy. It was a small helicopter made of bamboo and paper, designed by Alphonse Pénaud, a French aviation inventor. When Milton Wright tossed the toy into the air, it spun and flew up to the ceiling, leaving the two boys utterly astonished. This wasn't just a delightful moment on a Christmas morning. It was the first spark that ignited a passion that would last a lifetime. But what was remarkable was the boys' reaction. Instead of just playing with the gift until it broke, Wilbur and Orville took it apart, studied every detail, and tried to build larger versions. Their first attempt failed. Their homemade helicopters were too heavy to fly. This was their first lesson in proportion and weight, a lesson the two brothers would learn again and again in the future. But to understand why these two men were able to achieve what the rest of the world couldn't, we must understand who they were. Wilbur Wright was born on April 16, 1867, in Millville, Indiana. Orville Wright was born on August 19, 1871, in Dayton, Ohio. They grew up in a family of 5 brothers, with their mother, Susan Koerner Wright, a woman with exceptional mechanical skills. She often made toys for her children and repaired everything in the house herself. This is the invaluable legacy she left to her 2 sons. In 1885, when Wilbur was 18, a tragic event changed the course of his life. During an ice hockey game, Wilbur was struck in the face with a hockey stick by an opposing player, causing him to lose all his front teeth and suffer a serious injury. But the physical injury wasn't the worst part. Wilbur fell into a prolonged depression, abandoning his plans to attend Yale University. For the next 3 years, he barely left home, caring for his mother who was suffering from tuberculosis. Susan Wright died in 1889, leaving Wilbur with deep grief, but also strengthening the special bond between him and Orville. Here's a crucial point that many people don't realize. Wilbur and Orville weren't two independent geniuses. They were a single entity, a dual mind with two personalities that complemented each other perfectly. Wilbur, calm, thoughtful, capable of profound theoretical analysis. Orville, dynamic, creative, excelling at turning ideas into reality. They never quarreled in the conventional sense. Instead, they debated. Intense, scientific debates that could last for hours, but never with resentment. As Orville once said, "He often defended my point, and I often defended his. We changed our minds many times, and often ended up not knowing who was arguing for which point." In 1889, after their mother's death, the two brothers started their first business, a small newspaper called the West Side News, later renamed the Evening Item. They designed and built their own printing press from scrap materials. But the newspaper business wasn't very successful, and by 1892, they found a better business opportunity: bicycles. 1892 marked the beginning of the bicycle craze in America. Safe bicycles with two wheels of the same size replaced the dangerous high-wheeled bicycles. Wilbur and Orville opened a bicycle repair shop called Wright Cycle Exchange, later renamed Wright Cycle Company. But they didn't stop at just repairing bicycles. By 1896, they began manufacturing their own bicycles with unique designs. This work not only provided a steady income but also gave them invaluable skills: precision metalworking, mechanical balancing, and, most importantly, an understanding of stability and control. But why did the two bicycle mechanics decide to conquer the skies? The answer lies in a tragic event on August 9, 1896. Otto Lilienthal, Germany's famous flying man, fell 15 meters while testing one of his gliders. He died the following day, leaving behind the haunting words, "Small sacrifices must be made." Otto Lilienthal had over 2,000 successful glides, but his death posed a crucial question. Could humans fly safely? News of Lilienthal's death appeared in newspapers across America, and it struck Wilbur Wright, then 29 years old, to the heart. But Wilbur's reaction was not fear or despair. Instead, he began reading everything he could find about aviation. Over the next 3 years, from 1896 to 1899, Wilbur transformed his small bicycle shop into a private aviation library. On May 30, 1899, an important letter was sent from Dayton, Ohio to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. This was Wilbur Wright's first letter on aviation, and it revealed an astonishing scientific mindset from someone without a college degree. Wilbur wrote, "I believe that humans can fly, and I am studying this matter with serious practical intent." He requested that the Smithsonian Institution send him all available scientific literature on flight. The Smithsonian responded with a thick package of documents, including the works of Otto Lilienthal, Octave Chanute, Samuel Langley, and Louis-Pierre Mouillard. Wilbur read it all. He studied the work of Sir George Cayley, who had identified the 3 fundamental forces of flight: lift, drag, and thrust. He analyzed Lilienthal's failure, and then he realized something that most aviation pioneers had overlooked. The problem wasn't flight, but control. Let me explain this key discovery. At the end of the 19th century, most inventors focused on creating enough lift to get a machine into the air. They designed larger wings and more powerful engines. But Wilbur Wright saw the problem from a completely different angle. He thought, "The plane that can fly but cannot be controlled is like a wild horse, powerful but useless." This is why Otto Lilienthal died. He could fly, but he couldn't control his glider when faced with a sudden gust of wind. In the summer of 1899, Wilbur had a moment of genius. One day, while at a bicycle shop, he accidentally twisted a long cardboard box containing bicycle inner tubes. He saw how the box deformed when twisted and suddenly understood. This is how to control an airplane. By twisting the wingtips in different directions, uneven lift can be created, causing the plane to tilt to one side. This is the concept of wing warping, one of the three key inventions of the Wright brothers. But Wilbur wasn't in a hurry. Before building the real airplane, he decided to test the idea with a small model. In August 1899, he built a 1.5-meter-long biplane kite from bamboo and fabric. A system of strings and sticks allowed him to twist the wingtips remotely. He took the kite to a field outside Dayton and test flew it. A group of children gathered to watch the strange uncle fly the kite. But this wasn't a game. Wilbur was conducting a serious scientific experiment. He was testing the ability to twist the wings to make the kite tilt to the left, then to the right, and then back to balance. It worked. For the first time, a flying device could be controlled along 3 spatial axes. This was a breakthrough no one else had achieved. That evening, Wilbur ran home and told Orville about it. The conversation lasted late into the night. Orville, who had been focused on his bicycle business, was captivated by his brother's enthusiasm. They decided they would build a real manned glider. But to do this, they needed a place with strong, stable winds and far away from curious crowds. Wilbur wrote to the U.S. Weather Bureau asking about the windiest places in America. He received a list, and one name stood out: Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a remote stretch of sand dunes along the Atlantic coast with average wind speeds of 21 kilometers per hour. Perfect. But before they could get to Kitty Hawk, they needed money. Their bicycle business was doing well, but it wasn't enough to fund the expensive aeronautical research. They needed a financial plan. What was their decision? They would self-finance by saving from selling the bicycles and do everything by hand to reduce costs. No loans, no investors. This was a crucial decision because it gave them complete freedom in their research, free from pressure from anyone. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., another aviation project was underway with enormous funding. Samuel Pierpont Langley, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and a renowned astronomer, received $50,000 from the U.S. War Department, equivalent to over $1.5 million today, to build an aircraft. Langley had a team of engineers, a state-of-the-art workshop, and government support. The press placed all its hopes on him. And the Wright brothers? No one knew them. In September 1900, 33-year-old Wilbur Wright boarded a train from Dayton to Norfolk, Virginia, carrying carefully packed parts for glider number 1. Orville would follow a few days later after arranging business at the bicycle shop. From Norfolk, Wilbur had to travel by boat to Kitty Hawk. The journey lasted several days across turbulent seas. When Wilbur arrived at Kitty Hawk, he was shocked by its desolation. It wasn't a town, as he had imagined. It was a few wooden houses scattered across vast white sand dunes with constant mosquitoes and sandstorms. The entire area had a population of less than 100 people, mostly fishermen. There were no hotels, no restaurants. Wilbur had to rent a room at the home of Bill Tate's family, one of the few locals. Bill Tate, a kind and curious man, became the Wright brothers' first friend at Kitty Hawk. When Wilbur explained that he was there to experiment with flight, Tate thought he was a little crazy, but was still willing to help. Bill Tate's wife, Addie, later even allowed the Wright brothers to use her sewing machine to sew fabric onto the aircraft frame. Orville arrived a few days later, and the two brothers began assembling glider number 1. This glider had a wingspan of 5.2 meters, made from white muslin stretched over an ash wood frame. The entire structure weighed only about 23 kilograms. The two-tiered wing design was based on Octave Chanute's work, but with Wilbur's unique wing twisting system. The first days at Kitty Hawk were a relentless series of tests. They flew the glider like a kite, unmanned, to test lift. But right from the start, they encountered a problem. The actual lift was much lower than calculated based on Otto Lilienthal's datasheets, the same datasheets used by the entire aviation community. This was a surprising and worrying finding. If Lilienthal's datasheets were wrong, then all their calculations were meaningless. But they didn't give up. They adjusted the angle of attack of the wings, experimenting with different wind speeds. In October 1900, they began manned glider trials. Wilbur lay face down on the lower wing, holding onto the wooden frame, while Orville and Bill Tate held the ropes to control the glider from the ground. The first flights were only a few meters high and lasted a few seconds. But each time, they learned something new. They realized that the wing twist worked, but not as perfectly as expected. There were unexpected side effects. Sometimes the glider reacted in the opposite way to the controls. These were mysteries to solve. After 3 weeks of experimentation at Kitty Hawk, they packed up and returned to Dayton at the end of October. They brought back a treasure trove of documents, notebooks with hundreds of observations, sketches, and data. But more importantly, they brought back a challenging question. Why was Lilienthal's theory wrong? The answer to this question would lead them to an invention perhaps even more important than the airplane, an invention without which aeronautical science would have taken many more years to develop. But to get there, they had to face 1901, the worst year in their journey to conquer the skies. The winter of 1900 to 1901 in Dayton was a period of frantic research. Wilbur and Orville spent hours each evening in their living room analyzing data from Kitty Hawk. They graphed, recalculated lift, and compared it to Otto Lilienthal's formulas. The conclusion became increasingly clear. Something seriously wrong with the existing theory of aerodynamics. But instead of giving up, they decided to build a new glider, glider number 2, larger and improved upon the previous year's experience. They increased the wingspan to 6.7 meters, nearly doubling the wing area, hoping to generate enough lift as theoretically predicted. If Lilienthal's data was correct, this glider would be able to lift a person in wind speeds of only about 27 kilometers per hour. In July 1901, the two brothers set off again for Kitty Hawk, this time with higher expectations and greater ambitions. They brought not only glider number 2, but also materials to build a larger wooden hut, a real workshop and living quarters. They no longer had to live in people's homes. This hut, measuring 7.6 meters by 4.6 meters, would become their base for many years to come. But July at Kitty Hawk was a real hell. Temperatures reached 38 degrees Celsius in the wooden hut. Mosquitoes attacked relentlessly. Orville later described, "They came in such dense swarms that they obscured the sun. They covered every exposed skin. They bit through clothing. We couldn't sleep a wink at night because of the mosquitoes." But worse than all that, the mosquitoes awaited them. On July 27, 1901, they began testing glider number 2. From the very first flight, they realized disaster. The glider needed much stronger winds than calculated to fly. Instead of the predicted 27 kilometers per hour, it needed at least 40 kilometers per hour. The lift was only 1/3 of what Lilienthal's theory required. What did this mean? It meant that the entire theoretical foundation upon which the aviation community relied was gravely flawed. But the problems didn't end there. In the following days, as they tried to fly higher and farther, a strange and dangerous phenomenon occurred. When Wilbur tried to twist its wings to turn to one side, the glider would sometimes turn in the opposite direction. Worse still, it would begin to spin and spiral downwards. Wilbur nearly died on one such occasion, only escaping by hitting soft sand dunes instead of hard ground. They called this phenomenon well digging, the roller coaster spiraling down as if digging a well in midair. This was a completely new problem that no one had ever encountered before, because no one else had a control system as sophisticated as theirs. Lilienthal controlled the roller coaster by shifting his center of gravity, a primitive method. Wright Brothers, on the other hand, was trying to control it mechanically, and this created far more complex problems. August 1901 was the darkest month. Octave Chanute, a 69-year-old French-American civil engineer considered a master of flight, came to Kitty Hawk to visit them. Chanute was one of the few respected figures in aviation, and they held him in high regard. But as Chanute witnessed their repeated failures, he began to doubt their methods. He suggested they revert to a more traditional design. This greatly disappointed Wilbur. On August 20th, 1901, after nearly 4 weeks battling mosquitoes, heat, and repeated failures, the two brothers packed up and returned to Dayton. On the train back, Wilbur said to Orville a famous line, "People won't be able to fly for another 1,000 years." This was the moment Wilbur Wright, the world's most persistent man, almost gave up on his dream. But Orville refused to accept this surrender. Over the following weeks at Dayton, Orville repeatedly convinced Wilbur that they had learned too much to give up now. The problem wasn't that they couldn't fly. They could fly. The problem was that they didn't fully understand the principles of aerodynamics, and if the existing data sheets were wrong, they had to create new ones, their own, accurate ones. This was a decisive moment. Instead of continuing to rely on others' research, they decided to become real scientists. They would conduct systematic experiments to understand precisely the principles of lift and drag. But how? They couldn't fly thousands of times to collect data. They needed a faster, more controlled method. The answer is an invention that will revolutionize aviation: the wind tunnel. Actually, wind tunnels aren't a new invention. European scientists had used them before, but existing wind tunnels were either too rudimentary or too expensive. Wilbur and Orville decided to build one themselves, a precise, controllable wind tunnel, right in their bike shop. In October 1901, they began designing. Their wind tunnel was a 1.8-meter-long wooden box with a 40-centimeter square cross-section. An old shop fan was refurbished to create a steady airflow at a speed of about 43 to 56 kilometers per hour. But the genius lay in the measuring equipment. They built a sophisticated scale that could measure lift and drag with unprecedented accuracy. From October to December 1901, for 2 consecutive months, Wilbur and Orville spent almost every spare minute in the wind tunnel. They built over 200 different wing models with varying shapes, curvatures, and proportions. Each model was tested from numerous angles. They meticulously recorded every number and every observation. This work was incredibly tedious and exhausting. Day after day, hour after hour, they changed models, recorded data, and analyzed it. But gradually, a clear picture began to emerge. They discovered that Lilienthal's data table was wrong because he had used an incorrect Smeaton coefficient, a constant used to calculate wind pressure. For over 50 years, the entire scientific community had been using the wrong number. More importantly, they discovered that the shape of the aircraft wing affected performance more than they had thought. Some shapes produced good lift but high drag. Others were the opposite. They needed to find the optimal shape, the one with the highest lift-to-drag ratio. By December 1901, after thousands of experiments, they had produced the most accurate aerodynamic data sheets in the world. This is no exaggeration. For nearly 2 decades afterward, aircraft designers worldwide would rely on these data sheets. The Smithsonian Institution, the very organization that had once sent them erroneous documents, would later have to acknowledge that the Wright Brothers data sheets were the gold standard of early aviation. But they still haven't solved the well-digging problem, the dangerous spiraling phenomenon. This problem will require a third invention, one that no one had thought of before. In early 1902, with the new data sheets in hand, Wilbur and Orville began designing glider number 3. This one would be completely different. Based on data from the wind tunnel, they designed longer and narrower wings, a wingspan of 9.8 meters, but a width of only 1.5 meters. This ratio, 6.5 to 1, provided optimal aerodynamic performance, according to their calculations. They also changed the curvature of the wings. Instead of the deep curve of the previous design, they reduced the curvature to just 1/20th, a small but significant change based on wind tunnel data. and they added a new element, a dual vertical tail at the rear, which they hope will improve stability. In August 1902, they returned to Kitty Hawk for the third time. This time, there was no Octave Chanute to doubt, just the two brothers, their wooden hut, the sand dunes, and glider number 3. The weather that year was as terrible as every other year. The August storms nearly blew their hut away. One night, they had to cling to the posts to keep the hut from being swept away. But as the weather calmed and they began testing, everything changed. Glider number 3 flew better than anything they had ever seen. Lift was exactly as predicted. Finally, theory and practice matched. The wing twists worked smoothly. In the first days of September, they performed hundreds of successful glides, some lasting over 20 seconds. But the well-digging problem persisted, though less frequently. On September 23, 1902, Orville suffered a serious accident. While attempting to adjust after a wing twist, the glider suddenly plunged and crashed into the sand. Orville sustained injuries to his face and flank. Fortunately, nothing serious happened, but the incident forced them to find a solution. That night, in his wooden cabin, Orville lay awake, deep in thought. Suddenly, he realized the problem. When twisting the wings to turn, one wing generated more lift than the other. This was desirable, but the wing with more lift also generated more drag. This slowed that side down, causing the glider to turn in the opposite direction. The fixed vertical tail was making things worse because it resisted the rotation. The solution? Make the vertical tail rovable, a steerable vertical rudder. The next morning, Orville shared his idea with Wilbur. They debated all morning. Wilbur proposed an improvement. Instead of independently controlling the vertical rudder, why not connect it to the wing twisting system? When the pilot twists the wing to the left, the vertical rudder would automatically turn to the right to compensate for the uneven drag. This was a brilliant idea, a coordinated control system. They immediately set to work on the renovation. They replaced the fixed twin vertical rudder with a single rotatable vertical rudder, connected to the wing twisting system via a system of wires and pulleys. Within days, glider number 3 was completely renovated. October 3, 1902, was a historic day, though few people know about it. On that day, Wilbur performed a 26-second glide, covering a distance of 189 meters. But more important than the time and distance was control. Wilbur was able to turn left, turn right, ascend and descend, all smoothly and safely. For the first time in history, a man had complete control over his movements in three-dimensional air. These are the 3 key inventions of the Wright brothers. Twisting the wings to control the rolling motion. Horizontal steering wheel at the front for controlling the uphill and downhill movement. Longitudinal rudders are used in conjunction to control rotational movement. This 3-axis control system, what we now call the aileron, elevator, and rudder, is the foundation of every modern aircraft. But in 1902, it was a completely new concept, an invention that no one else had thought of. In October 1902, the two brothers made over 700 gliders at Kitty Hawk. Orville set a record with a 43-second flight. Wilbur flew 189 meters in a single go. They circled back and forth. They flew in both light and strong winds. Each time, the control system worked perfectly. Octave Chanute visited again, and this time he was overwhelmed. He wrote to colleagues in France and Germany saying that the Wright brothers had solved the problem of flight. But Wilbur and Orville knew that flight was only the first step. The real goal was powered flight, real airplanes. At the end of October 1902, they packed up and returned to Dayton. This time, there was no sense of disappointment like the previous year. They knew exactly what they needed to do next. They needed an engine 1, light enough for the plane to fly, but powerful enough to generate thrust. And they needed a propeller, not a regular boat propeller, but one specifically designed for flight. The engine problem seemed simple. They wrote to at least 10 engine manufacturers in the US and Europe requesting an engine weighing around 41 kilograms with at least 8 horsepower. All refused. They said it was impossible to manufacture such a lightweight engine with that power. Some didn't even bother to reply. So they decided to build it themselves. Charlie Taylor, a mechanic working in their bicycle shop, was given the task. Charlie was a humble 34-year-old man with exceptional metalworking skills. Wilbur and Orville gave him the blueprints and the request. Build a 4-cylinder internal combustion engine as light and powerful as possible. Within 6 weeks, a remarkable feat of speed, Charlie Taylor had built the engine. It weighed just 82 kilograms, including coolant and fuel, and produced 12 horsepower, exceeding expectations. The engine block was cast from aluminum, a rare and expensive material at the time. No carburetors were available, so Charlie made one himself. No suitable ignition system was found, so he designed one. This was a masterpiece of practical engineering. But the propeller problem was far more complex. Wilbur and Orville initially thought they could use the theory of ship propellers. They searched through literature on propeller design, but they discovered something astonishing. There was no theory at all. Ship designers made propellers by experience and trial and error. No one fully understood the scientific principles behind them. Wilbur and Orville realized that an aircraft propeller is essentially a rotating wing. Each point on the propeller moves at a different speed. The part near the axis rotates slowly, the part further away rotates quickly. Therefore, the angle of the propeller must vary along its length to optimize performance. This is a complex mathematical problem. They spent months trying to solve this problem. The debates about the propeller blades between Wilbur and Orville lasted for hours, sometimes into the late night. They argued about the shape, the angle of rotation, the number of blades, 2 or 3, and the optimal length. Charlie Taylor later recalled, "One day they would argue that 2 blades rotating in the same direction was best. The next day they would completely change their minds and say the blades had to rotate in opposite directions to eliminate torque. Finally, after countless calculations and debates, they designed 2 2.6-meter-long wooden propellers that rotated in opposite directions. Each propeller had an intricately twisted shape, calculated to generate maximum thrust. They hand-carved the propellers from spruce wood, a task requiring high precision. And because a suitable gearbox wasn't available, they used a bicycle chain drive system to transmit power from the motor to the propellers. By the spring of 1903, everything was ready. They had finished building what they called the Wright Flyer, their first airplane. It had a wingspan of 12.3 meters and weighed 340 kilograms when fully fueled. The engine was located on the right center, with the pilot on the left for balance. 2 propellers were positioned behind the wings, propelling the aircraft forward. But before they could take Flyer to Kitty Hawk, they needed to test the engine and propellers. For weeks, they test drove the engine in a bicycle shop. The noise was deafening. Neighbors complained. But Wilbur and Orville didn't care. They were preparing for the biggest moment of their lives. In September 1903, they transported Flyer to Kitty Hawk. This time, it wasn't a summer operation. They stayed throughout the fall and winter, determined to fly before the year ended. The winter weather at Kitty Hawk was much harsher. Temperatures dropped below 0 degrees Celsius. The wind was biting, but they persevered. October and November dragged on with a series of technical problems. The propeller shaft cracked. They had to send it back to Dayton for Charlie Taylor to fabricate a new shaft from stronger steel. The engine initially ran erratically. The chain drive system slipped. Each problem was solved patiently. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a remarkable event took place on October 7, 1903. Samuel Langley, a man with $50,000 from the government, was ready for the first public flight of the aerodrome. The entire Washington press was invited to watch. Boats and cameras were prepared. This would be Langley's moment of glory. The aerodrome was placed on a launch pad on the Potomac River. Charles Manly Langley's brave assistant sat in the cockpit. The engines roared. The launch pad activated. The aerodrome surged forward and instantly plunged into the river like a stone. Manly nearly drowned before being rescued. The press scoffed. The New York Times wrote, "We hope this will be the last wasted public money on pointless flying experiments." Langley tried again on December 8, 1903. The result was even worse. The aerodrome broke its wing shortly after liftoff and crashed into a frozen river. This time, Manly nearly died from hypothermia. Langley's career ended in disgrace. The U.S. government declared it would never invest more money in aviation. News of Langley's failure was published in newspapers across America, including small newspapers in North Carolina. Wilbur and Orville read the news at Kitty Hawk. But they didn't gloating. They simply continued their work in silence. They knew that Langley had failed because he focused on the powerful engine and neglected the control system. The aerodrome might have enough thrust to fly, but it couldn't be controlled. By mid-December, the Wright Flyer was finally ready. All the technical issues had been resolved. They were just waiting for the right weather. A day with moderate wind to aid takeoff, but not so strong as to be dangerous. On December 14, 1903, the wind died down. They decided to try flying. Wilbur won the right to fly first through a lucky coin toss, but the flight failed. Wilbur pulled the rudder sideways too hard during takeoff, causing Flyer to climb too high, lose speed, and crash after only 3 seconds. Fortunately, only a few parts were slightly damaged. They spent 2 days making repairs. And then came December 17, 1903, a frigid day, temperatures near freezing, with strong winds of 43 kilometers per hour blowing from the north. These were not ideal conditions, but they had waited too long. If they didn't fly today, they would have to wait until the following year. They invited 5 men from a nearby life-saving station to testify: John T. Daniels, Will Doe, Adam Etheridge, W.C. Brinkley, and a 17-year-old boy named Johnny Moore. These men thought the Wright brothers were a little crazy, but they were curious to see what would happen. This time it was Orville's turn. He lay prone on the lower wing, his hands gripping the control levers. Wilbur stood beside the wing, ready to assist if needed. At 10:35 a.m., Orville released the brakes. The Wright Flyer began rolling on the wooden tracks. John Daniels, who had never held a camera before, was tasked with taking the photograph. He placed his hand on the cumbersome camera button, waiting for the right moment. The Flyer accelerated. 10 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters. And then, at about 12 meters on the track, the wheels left the ground. The Wright Flyer was flying. At that moment, John Daniels pressed the shutter button. The historic photograph was captured, a blurry but unmistakable image of a machine flying through the air with Wilbur running alongside. The flight lasted just 12 seconds and covered 36 meters, shorter than the wingspan of a modern Boeing 747. But those 12 seconds changed the world. For the first time in history, a machine heavier than air, carrying a human being, took off and landed safely on its own power under the complete control of the pilot. But they didn't stop there. They flew 3 more times that morning. Wilbur's second flight lasted 12 seconds. Orville's third lasted 15 seconds. And on the fourth, the final flight of the day, Wilbur flew for 59 seconds and covered 260 meters before landing safely. It was a perfect flight, almost a minute in the air, flying smoothly and completely under control. Wilbur could have flown even further, but he decided to land because the wind was picking up and his fuel was running low. After landing, 5 witnesses and the 2 brothers were discussing the flights when a sudden, strong gust of wind struck. It flipped the Wright Flyer upside down. John Daniels, who tried to hold on to the wing, was trapped in the frame and rolled around with it. He escaped with a few bruises, but the flyer was severely damaged. It would never fly again. But never mind. Mission accomplished. The two brothers went into the hut, and Orville sent a brief telegram to their father in Dayton. 4 successful flights this morning, all against 21 miles per hour winds. Started from below average speeds. Average speed through the air, 31 miles. Longest flight, 59 seconds. Inform the press. Home for Christmas. And that was it. No cheering crowds, no reporters. Just 5 fishermen, 2 engineer brothers, and a blurry photograph proving that humans had flown. You might think that after conquering the skies, Wilbur and Orville Wright would instantly become national heroes. But the reality is quite the opposite. This is perhaps one of the strangest paradoxes in the history of science. The greatest invention of the 20th century was ignored by the world for almost 5 years. Let me tell you this surprising story. When Milton Wright, the bishop, received the telegram from Kitty Hawk, he was thrilled. He contacted the Dayton Daily News, hoping they would publish it on the front page. But the editors of the local newspaper were skeptical. They thought it was some kind of hoax. They refused to publish it. The story spread to several other newspapers. The Norfolk Virginian Pilot published an article on December 18th, but with much misinformation. They wrote that the plane flew 5 kilometers, when, in reality, it only reached 260 meters. Major newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune remained completely silent. They couldn't believe that 2 anonymous bicycle mechanics could accomplish what Samuel Langley, with his team of engineers and $50,000, had failed miserably just 9 days earlier. But even more astonishing was the reaction of the scientific community. Octave Chanute, a friend and mentor of the Wright brothers, presented their achievement at an international scientific conference in Paris in April 1903. But European scientists dismissed it as fiction. They said, "The Americans are exaggerating as usual. If Langley, with all his resources, couldn't do it, how could 2 craftsmen? And Wilbur and Orville? They weren't interested in glory or recognition. They cared about one thing, making the aircraft truly useful." The 59-second flight was an achievement, but not enough to prove its practical value. They needed to fly longer, farther, and more reliably. In 1904, they built the Flyer 2 and looked for a test site closer to home. They rented a field called Huffman Prairie, about 13 kilometers from Dayton, owned by banker Torrance Huffman. But Huffman Prairie didn't have the high sand dunes like Kitty Hawk for takeoff. They had to build a winch-based launch system, a tall tower with heavy weights falling down to pull the aircraft up to speed. The Flyer 2 had many improvements. The engine was more powerful, 15 horsepower instead of 12. The control system was refined. But the biggest problem wasn't technical. It was the weather. Huffman Prairie didn't have the strong, consistent wind that Kitty Hawk had. Many days they sat, waiting in vain. Throughout 1904, they made 105 test flights. Most were short and unimpressive. They experienced numerous minor accidents. But gradually, they learned to fly in calm conditions. And on September 20th, 1904, Wilbur achieved a significant milestone, his first flight lasting more than a minute. Specifically, 1 minute and 36 seconds, completing a full circle around the field. By November 9th, 1904, Wilbur had flown for 5 minutes continuously, completing 4 circles. This was no longer an experimental aircraft. It was a real, controllable flying vehicle. But there was still no attention from the press or the government. Why? There are several reasons. First, the Wright brothers were very protective of their secrets. They didn't allow reporters to take detailed photographs of the aircraft. They didn't publish the design blueprints. They feared others would copy the invention they had dedicated years of effort to. Secondly, they were trying to sell the aircraft to the U.S. government before making a public announcement. But negotiations with the U.S. War Department were progressing extremely slowly. Military officials were still reeling from Langley's failure, and they didn't trust other fraudsters. In 1905, they built the Flyer 3, their first perfect aircraft. This was a technological leap forward. The control system was completely improved. The engines were more reliable, and most importantly, the aircraft could fly stably for extended periods. On October 5, 1905, Wilbur achieved an incredible record, flying continuously for 39 minutes and 23 seconds, covering a distance of 39 kilometers, completing 29 laps around Huffman Prairie. This is the longest flight ever undertaken by anyone in the world. Wilbur only landed due to running out of fuel, not because of any technical problems. Several locals witnessed these flights. They stood at the edge of the field staring at the sky in amazement. Some people riding horse-drawn carriages passed by and saw the strange machine circling. But even these people didn't quite believe their eyes. One local farmer said, "I saw it, but I didn't believe it was real. It must be some kind of magic." In late 1905, Wilbur and Orville decided to cease flying entirely until they secured a contract to sell the aircraft. They did not want to disclose any further information until protected by patents and commercial agreements. This was a bold decision. They stopped flying for nearly 3 years, from late 1905 to mid-1908. During this time, they focused on negotiating with governments. They contacted the U.S. War Department, the British government, and the French government. All were skeptical. The U.S. War Department even refused to meet them in person, saying they weren't interested in proposals from dreamers. This was the most financially difficult period for the Wright brothers. They had invested all their savings in aviation research. The bicycle shop was still operating but wasn't very profitable. They weren't getting paid for their flying work, and they had to spend money on lawyers to protect their patents. The patent. This is a dramatic story in itself. They filed the patent application in March 1903, even before the historic flight at Kitty Hawk. The application wasn't for an airplane, that concept was still too new, but for a method of controlling a flying device. The patent office rejected the application several times, demanding clarification and proof. Finally, after a 3-year wait, patent number 821393 was granted on May 22, 1906. This patent would become one of the most important and controversial patents in history. It protected not only their specific wing-twisting system, but the entire concept of 3-axis control. This meant that anyone wanting to build an aircraft with a similar control system had to pay royalties to the Wright brothers. And because 3-axis control was the only effective way to control an aircraft, this created a true monopoly. While the Wright brothers remained silent in Ohio, Europe began to awaken. French aviation pioneers such as Alberto Santos Dumont, Louis Blériot, and Henri Farman began experimenting with their own aircraft. Santos Dumont made the first public flight in Europe on October 23, 1906, flying 60 meters before a crowd of thousands in Paris. European newspapers declared Santos Dumont to be the first to fly. This greatly frustrated Wilbur and Orville. They had been flying since 1903, covering 39 kilometers in 1905, but because there was no public and sufficient evidence, the world did not believe them. European journalists even called them the Dayton Bluffers. This situation could not continue. In early 1908, they finally signed 2 important contracts. The first was with the U.S. War Department, $25,000 for an aircraft capable of carrying 2 people and flying at a speed of at least 64 kilometers per hour. The second was with a French corporation to establish a subsidiary in France to manufacture and sell the aircraft in Europe. But both contracts had a condition. They had to prove the aircraft could fly in front of officials. This is why 1908 became the year they had to show the world. In May 1908, Wilbur Wright boarded a ship to Europe, carrying a new aircraft, the Wright Model A, packed in wooden crates. Orville remained in America to prepare for demonstrations to the military. This was the first time the two brothers had worked separately in many years. Wilbur arrived in Le Mans, France, where he was to demonstrate to French investors and officials. But when he opened the containers, he discovered disaster. The engine had been severely damaged during transit. He spent weeks repairing it, working alone in a small workshop, while the French press mocked him and called him an American swindler. But on August 8, 1908, everything changed. Before a crowd of about 1,000 people, including journalists, engineers, investors, and curious onlookers, Wilbur Wright flew for the first time over France. The first flight lasted only 1 minute and 45 seconds, but it was enough to silence everyone. What astonished the Europeans wasn't that the plane could fly. They had seen Santos Dumont and others fly. What stunned them was the absolute control. Wilbur didn't just fly straight, he flew tight circles, figure eights, ascending, descending, all with the precision of an artist. Santos Dumont's and other European pioneers' planes could only fly straight and were very difficult to control. But the Wright Model A flew like a tamed bird. A French journalist wrote, "We were wrong. Wright brothers flew ahead of everyone else, and they remained ahead of us for many years." Louis Blériot, one of France's leading aviation pioneers, said after watching Wilbur fly, "I have to start all over again. Compared to Wright, we are like children." In the following weeks, Wilbur continued his performances. He set new records day after day. He flew 110 meters high, a new world record. He flew for over 2 hours continuously. He carried passengers, the first people in the world to experience flying in an airplane. The crowds grew to tens of thousands. Wilbur became the most famous person in Europe. But while Wilbur was conquering Europe, Orville was facing tragedy in America. In September 1908, Orville began demonstrating to the U.S. Army at Fort Myer, Virginia, near Washington, D.C. The first flights were very successful. Military officials were impressed. The press finally took notice and reported positively. But on September 17, 1908, a terrible accident occurred. Orville was flying with a passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, a 26-year-old Army officer. At an altitude of about 23 meters, one of the propellers cracked. The propeller struck the control cable, severing it. The plane lost control and plummeted to the ground at high speed. Orville suffered a broken leg, broken ribs, and a serious hip injury. But Thomas Selfridge suffered a traumatic brain injury and died a few hours later, becoming the first person in the world to die in a plane crash. News of the accident reached Wilbur in France. He was devastated, but couldn't return to the U.S. immediately due to performance commitments. Orville spent weeks in the hospital and would suffer from chronic back pain for the rest of his life. But neither brother gave up. In 1909, after Orville recovered, they completed demonstrations for the U.S. Army. This time it was a complete success. The Army bought the aircraft for $30,000, higher than the original contract price because the aircraft exceeded the speed requirements. 1909 was also the year they became real celebrities. They were invited to the White House to meet President William Howard Taft. They received gold medals from Congress. The city of Dayton held a grand celebration for the two brothers, a rare occurrence since they hated noise and ceremony. But glory came with problems. Other aircraft manufacturers began to appear everywhere, and many of them used similar control systems to Wright brothers without permission. This led to a series of patent lawsuits that lasted for years. Glenn Curtiss, a talented American aircraft manufacturer, became the main competitor and the subject of the biggest lawsuits. Curtiss developed a slightly different control system, using ailerons instead of wing twists, but Wright brothers argued that this still infringed on their patent for three-axis control. These lawsuits consumed a great deal of the Wright brothers' time, money, and energy. Wilbur was particularly obsessed with protecting his patents. He spent hours working with lawyers, preparing documents, and attending court hearings. This left him little time to continue innovating his technology. Meanwhile, the aviation industry was developing at a breakneck pace. In Europe, designers not bound by the Wright patent, due to differing patent laws, were making rapid advances. Airplanes became faster, more powerful, and safer. In 1909, Louis Blériot flew across the English Channel, a feat that thrilled all of Europe. In 1911, the aircraft was used for the first time in war, the Italian-Turkish War. Wright brothers remain respected pioneers, but they are no longer at the forefront of technology. The Wright Company, founded in 1909, manufactured aircraft but did not innovate much. They were bogged down in legal battles instead of focusing on research. In early 1912, Wilbur began to feel unwell. He had a fever and felt fatigued. Doctors diagnosed him with typhoid fever, a serious infectious disease. For weeks, Wilbur was bedridden, his health deteriorating. Orville and his family cared for him attentively, but his illness was too severe. On May 30th, 1912, Wilbur Wright died at the age of 45. His death was a great shock to Orville and the entire aviation community. A genius had passed away too soon. At his funeral, Milton Wright, his 83-year-old father, wrote in his diary, "A short life, full of purpose, meaning, and success." Orville continued working, but never quite the same way. He sold his stake in the Wright Company in 1915 and withdrew from commercial aircraft manufacturing. He devoted his time to small-scale research, consulting, and, most importantly, protecting his brother's legacy. A major controversy erupted after World War I. The Smithsonian Institution, which had funded Samuel Langley, claimed that Langley's aerodrome was actually capable of flying, and that Langley was the true pioneer of motorized aviation. They displayed the aerodrome in their museum with this controversial label. Orville was furious. He knew that Langley's aerodrome had never flown and lacked the proper control system. The dispute dragged on for decades. In protest, Orville sent the original 1903 Wright Flyer, the historic aircraft that flew at Kitty Hawk, to the Science Museum in London, England, refusing to give it to the Smithsonian. It wasn't until 1942, after the Smithsonian publicly admitted its mistake and removed the controversial label, that Orville agreed to bring the flyer back to the United States. But he died in 1948 before the aircraft was actually displayed at the Smithsonian. Orville Wright died on January 30th, 1948, at the age of 76, after a heart attack. He lived long enough to see jet planes, to see aircraft break the sound barrier, and to see aviation become a massive global industry. From his 12-second flight in 1903 to the commercial jet, all within a single lifetime. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the story of the two brothers who changed the world. But before we conclude, let me take a moment to reflect on the true meaning of this story. The Wright brothers weren't the first to dream of flying. They weren't the first to experiment with airplanes. They didn't even have the most money or the most education. So why did they succeed when hundreds of others failed? The answer lies in their method, a rigorous scientific approach combined with superb practical engineering skills. While others simply tried and failed, the Wright brothers analyzed, measured, and systematically experimented. They didn't blindly accept other people's theories. They verified them themselves. When they discovered Lilienthal's data table was wrong, they didn't give up. They created a new, more accurate data table. But most importantly, it was the concept of control. This was their genius discovery, a discovery no one else had thought of. While everyone else focused on how to fly, the Wright brothers understood that the real problem was how to control movement in 3 dimensions. Their 3-axis control system controlling roll, descent, and rotation is the foundation of every modern aircraft, from fighter jets to the Boeing 747. And remember this, they accomplished all of this for a total cost of about $1,000, less than 2% of Samuel Langley's budget. They built their own engines because nobody would sell them. They designed their own propellers because no theory existed. They built their own wind tunnel to generate accurate data, all in a small bike shop in Dayton, Ohio. But this story also has some sad lessons. Patent lawsuits consumed their precious energy. If Wilbur had devoted his time to innovation instead of lawsuits, he might have made even more contributions to aviation. And perhaps he wouldn't have been stressed to the point of weakening his immune system, leading to his premature death from typhoid. Today, you can stand at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and see the original 1903 Wright Flyer, the very aircraft that made that historic 12-second flight at Kitty Hawk. It hangs in a place of honor next to Apollo 11, the spacecraft that took humans to the moon. From 12 seconds on a sand dune to the moon in just 66 years. That is the power of a groundbreaking invention. Every time you fly, whether it's a short trip or a transcontinental flight, remember that it all started with two brothers who had no college degrees, no substantial financial resources, but possessed something invaluable: boundless passion, extraordinary perseverance, and a rigorous scientific methodology. Wilbur Wright once said, "If I owned a bird with a 1-meter wingspan, I would think it could fly. But I wouldn't think a bird with a 12-meter wingspan could fly just because I multiplied all the numbers by 12. It's not that simple." This is the difference between a true scientist and a dreamer. And Orville Wright, in his later years, looked up at the sky full of airplanes and said, "We dared to dream, but we never dared to dream of this. A world where millions of people fly every day as if it were the most normal thing in the world." That is the legacy of the Wright brothers. They didn't just show us how to fly. They showed us that with the right method, perseverance, and faith in science, no dream is too far-fetched. Thank you for following the Wright brothers' story on the History PhD channel. If you found this story interesting and inspiring, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with other history enthusiasts. Leave a comment letting me know what you think of this story, and especially, what do you think was the most important factor in the Wright brothers' success? And remember, each of us has our own Kitty Hawk Dunes challenges that seem insurmountable. But the story of Wilbur and Orville Wright shows us that with the right preparation, scientific methods, and unwavering perseverance, we can fly. See you again in the next fascinating historical stories on History PhD. Goodbye, and take flight.